But really the benefit of doing a prolonged fast, it's about, anywhere from 3 to 5 days periodically throughout your year, in addition to some intermittent fasting on a daily basis, you're actually activating autophagy, which is a form of cellular rejuvenation. It's where your cells actually go and repair or recycle old and dying parts of the cell and replace it with better functioning parts. And the reason that exists is because when food was not available to us, when evolving as Homo sapiens, we didn't have food available all the time, but we still needed to have the energy to go get the food if we haven't eaten for 3 days, right? We still have to go fight to get that bear or hunt that thing to get food. So our body adapted by repairing old and malfunctioning cell parts, replacing them for new ones so that your body actually functions better. We did not evolve to eat.
Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast. I'm excited, guys, about today's podcast because today we bring together perspectives that don't always get the spotlight in conversations about nutrition. In today's episode, we will have a vegetarian chatting with your host who just happens to be a carnivore. What I'm certain of is that my guest and I both are committed to helping those who hear our voices achieve metabolic health. As someone who was a vegetarian for around 8 years, and that's about 12 years ago, I just know firsthand that there are many benefits of eating plant-based as well. And since many of you who enjoy this podcast are convinced that excessive carbs can be harmful, I will ask today's guest how to eat a low-carb version of a plant-based diet as well. My hope is that we're going to learn from her experiences, insights, and strategies as we dig into how does a vegetarian thrive. If you're asking yourself, why would a carnivore like myself even bother to have a plant-based guest? Well, the answer is simple. We all need to learn how to live in harmony. And by the way, that was the topic of my discussion at the 2023 Symposium for Metabolic Health in San Diego. And I'll make sure to share that recording in the video notes if you want to check it out. So with that, let me introduce my guest. Her name is Melanie Murphy Richter. She is a dynamic registered dietitian nutritionist and the 2023 recognized Young Dietitian of the Year by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is a huge honor. As Director of Communications and Medical Science Educator at Nutra, she drives the company's mission to promote health through evidence-based nutrition. Melanie is also a graduate instructor at UC Irvine. I love California, so I'm so jealous. There's future healthcare professionals. She's also founder of the Wholistic Ritual. She combines science-backed nutrition with holistic healing. And I am totally excited to have this conversation. Haven't had a lot of plant-based folk on my podcast, but I am open arms and welcoming you to the podcast, Melanie. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about our conversation too. I also love all the differing opinions, not differing opinions, but I love all the different sides to nutrition because there's plenty of them.
and it's almost like one thing I love and hate about AI is that if you go to an AI program and you say Chat GPT and say, give me the explanation of why a plant-based diet is great for you, it'll give you that. And if I do the same thing for a keto or carnivore, it'll give you that. So it's like,
yep.
With citations.
Do you have an opinion?
Right, exactly.
Opinion?
And that's why we have to give people grace, because as you have learned and I've learned, when I was plant-based, I kind of went down that path and I just didn't really look around as much. I just stayed in that lane. And then when I went low carb, I kind of did the same thing initially, but I'm really trying not to get caught up in that rabbit hole thinking, because that'll get you in trouble. By the way, just so you know, Melanie, at the Symposium for Metabolic Health, which is a low carb organization founded by Low Carb USA, a few years ago, when they changed the symposium, they changed it from low carb to Symposium for Metabolic Health, and then they started inviting plant-based speakers as well. So that was I think everybody's understanding we have to see things through multiple lenses. So let's kind of have our conversation, I'll just start by kind of getting to know you a little bit better by asking you. You kind of have been doing more plant-based for a while. So why did you decide to have a plant-based diet as the best way to heal and to stay healthy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I was in my master's program, I studied under Dr. Walter Longo at USC, which is he and the USC community started the Longevity Institute there.
Mhm.
And I got my master's in healthspan and longevity and nutrition from that particular program. And I remember sitting in his class several years ago and just being blown away by it. Really did turn my head upside down when it came to nutrition and wellness and longevity specifically.
Mhm.
The impact of proteins, which I know we're going to dive into this in later on in the episode, but the impact of certain types of proteins on health span and longevity, and how well we can increase our lifespan
Mhm.
simply by making some swaps here and there. And mainly, not to give too much away, but when we do make swaps to eating more plant-based foods, specifically plant-based proteins, it can help to down regulate certain nutrient sensing pathways, mainly mTOR and IGF-1,
Yeah.
that can actually accelerate aging if they're over accelerated or if they're over triggered in your body. And plant-based diets don't do that nearly as heavily as animal-based diets do. And so and also I come from personally a very intense IBS gut background where I suffered for a really long time with IBS and gut issues. And I found that once my body did heal from that, I started to receive plant-based foods better in my diet and actually felt better with plant-based foods. It
Mhm.
wasn't always the case for me, because I think that depending on where you are in your gut journey, if you have a really really torn up gut, a leaky gut syndrome or IBS, sometimes plant-based eating can actually make it worse if you jump too quickly into that world. But once I did do my own healing, I found that I actually had more energy, better sleep, better skin health, all of these things when I went more plant-based.
Yeah, and that makes sense because when I went from the standard American diet to a plant-based diet, probably I guess 12 plus 8, so it's been about 20 years ago when I started, and I did it for 8 years. Definitely felt better when I did that, for sure.
Yeah.
And it really wasn't until I started, planning to write about diabetes and diet that I started to question it just a little bit based on some of the research I was seeing. And like I said earlier, you can find research to support any argument. And when I did the experiment, it just like it's like you felt better, but then I felt even better when I went low carb, which is really interesting. But I
Hmm.
definitely appreciate people making decisions to eat a certain way. You feel better because that's the best experiment of N of one. And if you felt better and everything's looking okay, I could easily understand why that would make sense for anybody. Now,
Hmm.
vegetarians and carnivores uh, can sometimes, be at odds with each other when it comes to how they look at food. Um, so when it comes to um, your understanding of an animal-based diet, have you thought about like your philosophy? I know you've had good personal experiences, but there are people who may have the same argument with an animal-based diet. So, do you find that like my approach is kind of meet people where they are, and if people are doing well, just roll with it. How do you approach that when you're in front of people who you may feel will benefit from your approach, but maybe are really hoping to maybe stay in that animal-based lane?
Yeah. I also share a very similar philosophy. I don't think it's beneficial or sustainable to tell somebody to completely 180 their diet and lifestyle if they've been living a particular way. And honestly, it's not. actually helpful. It's kind of
Yeah.
going back to what I said about the gut health. Sure, of course, we know that increased fiber and more plants is helpful for diversifying your gut microbiome, but going from eating 10 grams of fiber a day to eating 25 grams of fiber a day, that is not a good thing. It's going to give
Right.
you major gastric upset and diarrhea and all the things that we're trying to avoid, right? So,
Right.
I also like to meet people where they're at, and I also feel like there's a lot of personalization that comes
Mhm.
with diet. There is no such thing as one diet fitting well for everybody. It doesn't
Right.
exist. Everybody's cells function differently. Also, the air that we're breathing, the type of lifestyle that we live also impacts how our cellular communication works. How stressed we are when we sit down to eat is going to impact how well we're going to receive the nutrients that we're eating, right? So it's completely different for everybody. But the thing that and also, I want to point out that I do, kind of going back to my aha moment in my master's
Mhm.
degree program and really really diving into this longevity
Mhm.
element, because that's really what is driving me. I mean,
Yeah.
everyone's why is different. Some people's why is physique. Some people's
That's right.
why is heart health. Some
That's
people's
right.
why is, to be able to run a marathon and be, the best at that. My why is I want to live a long time in a really healthy body, right? So that's my why, and that's why I follow a longevity type of diet.
Yeah.
Um, and within that paradigm too, even though it is plant-based, it does still make room for some animal-based products here and there, because if you think about the types of nutrients that are missing, if you will
Mhm.
go 100% vegan or vegetarian, you're missing things like B12 that come from animal proteins. You may or may not be getting enough omega-3s depending on
Mhm.
how diligent you are with the meal planning and things like that. So I think that there's a ton of personalization when it comes to everybody's diet. And I don't think there is one size fits all at all. But I do think that when it comes to American eating, I do think that there is room for people to consider more plants within their diet, even if it's not a full vegan vegetarian route. I think
Mhm.
that just by simply making some swaps or some additions here and there, and I always I use the terminology in my own practice. I never I rarely talk about full eliminations when it comes to certain things, unless we're on a very specific anti-inflammatory route with somebody. I
Mhm.
talk about eating in addition to. So instead of changing everything that you're doing, add something. Add some plants into the meal that you're having with your animal proteins. It actually might enhance your ability to digest those proteins or to break them down in your body. So I definitely am in that philosophy with you, and I appreciate that. I do. I always like to meet people where they're at, and I hope I answered your question. I
No,
just went
you
on a
did.
big
I'm just like I'm loving it. Yeah, as I listen to you, it warms my heart because you're trying to be thoughtful and again, meet people where they are. And even when it comes to mTOR, because I've obviously looked at some of the research around that as well. And if you have this mTOR molecule that's so important in, regulating the growth of cells, and obviously there's various factors that will affect that. And it's not just nutrition. So we're kind of talking about nutrition today, but there's other issues in the environment that will affect that. And so what I tell people because I think the jury is still like you're hanging around a really high end educator, and you mentioned you're a good professor there. But I'm gonna tell you, I'm all about mitigation. So what I found for me personally is that because why did I end up carnivore? Because it was the only diet that made me feel great. But then you hear about things like mTOR, and you're like, oh my God, what do I do with that, right? And the reality is, so I think what I tell patients is, okay, first of all, if you're not carnivore, you can just eat more plants, and that'll help mitigate it a little bit. But there's other factors, and one of the things I'm a huge fan of is stress. trying to keep, even though we kind of
Mhm.
joked a little bit earlier about before we started, I was having a little stressful day, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I didn't do that well today, but, and I also know sleep is so important. So I make sure my sleep is good. So I know if I keep my stress down, I make sure my sleep is optimal. And there may be some supplements out there that would help with mTOR. I know, like I recommend alpha lipoic acid to people who have diabetes sometimes, or curcumin, and I know that those
Sure.
types of things are really helpful. So even fish oil. So what I tell people is, if you are in a lane where, because there's no perfect diet, if you really think about it, there's always some positives and negatives. For me, electrolytes may be an issue, right? So I think I try to tell people, if you're going to go down this path, then you be aware of any concerns that are there in that path. And as a doctor, my job is to try to mitigate it as much as possible. That way, people who choose to stay on that path will be able to do it in a safe way and to make it as optimal as possible. So that's kind of my approach. And I know that also I want to kind of touch a little bit about the people who come to this channel who are, maybe they heard the compelling vegetarian lecture at the symposium or your voice, and they really want to try it. Knowing in the African American community, Dr. Sabi, who was, kind of an herbalist who passed away on YouTube, he will really get that African American population pushing towards plants. So now you have the conundrum of, how do I, if I'm diabetic, if I'm only eating carbs, and some of which can spike my sugar, how do I manage that? So when you have somebody in front of you who wants to kind of do the plant-based, but they're also trying to do a low carb version of it,
Yes.
how do you approach that?
Oh, this is such a good question. I love this question. It is true, because most plant-based proteins, or a lot of the main sources of plant-based proteins, are carbohydrate heavy too. We're talking
Mhm.
about things like quinoa and
Yes.
beans and legumes all have really high levels of carbohydrate. But I do want to talk about, and I'll put a pin in this in a second, that there is a difference between total carbohydrates and net carbohydrates when it comes to diabetes. So I do want to talk about that in a second.
Yeah,
But
that's fair.
one thing that is a couple things that I'll say about diabetes, low carb, plant-based eating, is that you do have to prioritize healthy mono and polyunsaturated fats that also have protein. So things like nuts and seeds. I love hemp. Hemp seeds are a powerhouse protein. Super easy to add into things like smoothies, or
Mhm.
in a meal, even making hemp milk. Super great way to get omega 3s and plant-based proteins. Very low carbohydrate, but adding more nuts and seeds into your diet, especially you know, even more so when you consider the fact that people with diabetes also tend to have a higher rate of heart disease, and eating more mono and polyunsaturated fats can help mitigate heart related issues, right? Especially if you eat about 3 to 4 servings a day. As I think feel like that's the statistic, but triple check that stat in a minute.
Okay.
But
Well,
yeah, so I would say increasing mono and polyunsaturated fats from nuts and seeds is really helpful. Increasing more lower carb proteins like tofu,
mhm.
even certain types of tempeh are really helpful. And even things like edamame and things like that, I think are lower carb that are helpful. And you can always swap for lower carbohydrate veggies,
That's right.
non-starchy veggies. So things like spaghetti squash, zucchinis, instead of going for the sweet potatoes and the yams and the things that would be higher carbohydrate. So I think it's very doable. It's
Mhm.
super doable. But I think the one thing that's really important to note about people who go vegan vegetarian is that there isn't, and I want to say this tactfully, but it is very easy to go vegan vegetarian poorly.
Oh, yeah, I could imagine.
And I think that there's a lot of people that think that, oh, I'm turning vegan vegetarian, and I'll have patients come see me, and I really want to try this thing. And I'm like, great, what are you eating? And they'll tell me that they've gone to Trader Joe's and they're getting
That's
all of
right.
the snack foods
That's
at
right.
Trader Joe's that are vegan vegetarian, but are
That's right.
super high, still really refined,
That's right.
super high in carbohydrates.
That's
So
right.
if you're going to do this route, you are signing yourself up for being more responsible for cooking your own foods at home,
That's right.
being good at food pairing. It takes work. It takes a little bit of an adjustment. It takes work to understand how to do this properly and to do it well. And I
Yeah.
think that there's a lot of people out there that are like, oh, I'm vegan vegetarian. Let me just go eat all of the processed foods that are vegan vegetarian at Whole Foods and Trader Joe's. And that's definitely not going to be helpful for you.
No, not at all.
Um, so there's that component. And also I would say that I have lots of tips and tricks for people with diabetes in terms of mitigating glucose spikes
Hmm.
with carbohydrate foods. For instance, never eating them on an empty stomach. So
Hmm.
always making sure that you have a healthy protein, whether that be the tofus or nuts and seeds or nut butters first,
That's
the
right.
veggies second, and then the carbohydrate rich foods last. Simply by reordering how you eat makes a massive difference on how your body uptakes glucose and how your insulin responds to glucose. That simple trick. Deconstruct your meal and eat
That's
it
right.
in a different order. Like, don't
That's
even have
right.
to change too much. Really big tip. You could
That's
also
huge.
try things like apple cider vinegar before you eat your
Yeah.
meals, 15 to 20 minutes before you eat your meals. That will help to actually blunt your body's ability to utilize glucose quickly. So that's helpful. And for me, that's about 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar to about 5 ounces of water. So maybe 15, 20 minutes before a meal. A really helpful tip, by the way, we're going to the holiday season. We're not always that great over the holidays with our carbohydrate intake and sugar. So that's a helpful tip.
But yes. Yes, it is.
Um, but yeah, I also think it's important to understand. I know you had mentioned earlier about how that conference changed their name, and it got me thinking from low carb to metabolic.
Metabolic. That's right.
Yeah, which I love because there's a big difference between there's a really big difference between the total carbohydrates and net carbohydrates when it comes to diabetics. For instance, and if you're not already doing this, you should be doing this as a diabetic, is netting the difference where you take the total amount of carbohydrates, subtract the amount of fiber that's in it, and that's actually how many carbohydrates your body will be absorbing. And sometimes that can be, let's say, for example, there is 40 grams of carbohydrates in quinoa, but there's also 15 grams
Mhm.
of or total carbohydrates and 15 grams of fiber. You're actually only getting, X amount of carbohydrates in that. So it's important to understand fiber's role
Yep.
in all of this, because and again, another ode to being more diligent about cooking real food at home,
Hmm.
or understanding what real food means on this diet instead of going and just buying it in a packaged prepared thing from the
Yeah.
grocery store, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I had the one of the people who was at we had a metabolic revolution rally in Washington on October the 13th. So this will be the podcast will probably come out a week or so after we had that. And Vinny Tortorich was one of the people who spoke there, and he had a documentary, Beyond Impossible. So I bring that up to say um, it's okay to eat a Impossible or Beyond Meat burger if you're a vegetarian periodically, but you still got to put it in the processed food category. I
Yes.
just think it's important
Oh,
people
yes.
understand that. So when I was plant based, if you name some processed plant based item, I was eating it. And I just think that, as you have suggested, eat at home. But I like the nuance. Like my wife has to think about, she has type 1. So because she's more animal based, when she eats animal protein, the spike of her blood sugar, which is not really a spike, it's just a little bit of a hill versus a mountain. It's she would have to maybe take her insulin later
Mhm.
because if she takes it because the carb is what short acting is going to act on quickly. So she has to wait a little bit. And I think your nuance is so important. So people who, for whatever reason, like Dr. Rashani Sanghani, who is in India, which is a ton of plant-based people, endocrinologists there, and she has learned to adjust their diet. It's very nuanced. You almost need a dietary coach, right? And things like apple cider vinegar, just knowing the impact of that. And like you said, you can eat some fatty stuff or some protein stuff like tofu. So you can kind of add the protein and fat so you won't get as much of a spike. I just think those are the things you have to do because we don't want our people with type 2 or type 1 diabetes struggle with all of these spikes. But you may have a reason why you want to be plant-based. Like, again, Dr. Rashani's population in India, Hindu folk, they worship cows. They're not eating a cow. It's just
Yeah,
not happening.
absolutely.
So I think that's why it's important we have these conversations so we can give people nuance. I tell people, going back to your total versus net, is you understand the concept, which you've graciously shared, but then you do the experiment. And if you do the experiment and maybe you have a low carb or keto bread that shouldn't spike you, but it does, then it is what it is. But I find many times, like my wife, if she eats a low carb or keto bread, it doesn't spike her. But you have to, but I think it's important to test it just in case.
Personalization is key.
That's right. So
Yeah.
that N of 1 experiment, see what it does to you. Now, having said that, let's dive a little bit into the bioavailability of protein. Many people in the low carb community have been taught that the bioavailability of protein is better from animal sources. So now you have somebody in front of you. And you did say some work. Um, what should they know about plant protein so that they can kind of keep up with this animal protein in terms of bioavailability?
That's a good question, and I have a few things to say about it. The first is it's actually you would be surprised based on percentages that plant-based proteins. Okay, let's. I believe it's 92-ish percent of proteins from animals actually will be readily absorbed in the body.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very high amount.
Mm-hmm.
Plant-based proteins come in around 75%. So it's actually not a massive difference. Yes, there's a big difference. And part of
Mm-hmm.
that is because of the fiber, because of all of these,
Right.
fiber binds and removes and all of these
That's
things.
right.
But it's not that big of a difference. And I think that that's important to note that it's not that, I always count the fiber that's in my Ezekiel bread if I'm choosing to have that because it does count. Those nuts and seeds count. But a couple things I'll say about bioavailability. Number one, food pairing is a thing. For instance, we'll talk about spinach, for example, being really high in iron, but very low bioavailability on
Right.
its own,
Right.
right? Raw spinach, especially. So, a
Mm-hmm.
couple things. Usually, people do better when they prepare their vegetables slightly cooked, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get more out of your vegetables when you slightly cook them.
Yep.
Even in an al dente way, it breaks down that first barrier of phytonutrients and other things that help to actually give your body more time to absorb those things. And also when you pair them with other foods, this concept of
Yes.
of nutrient synergy
Mm-hmm.
is really important too. So like, and this is true for animal protein eaters. If you're anemic, if you don't have enough iron in your blood, but you're eating a lot of meat and you're like, what the heck is going on?
That's right.
Start pairing your animal proteins with vitamin C foods. So things
Mm-hmm.
like tomatoes,
Yep.
having lemon water. That vitamin C is going to help to pull the iron into your cells better. And that's true of plant-based sources of foods as well, that food synergy really matters and
Mm-hmm.
food pairing really matters. Um, and then I'll also say that preparation is pretty key when it comes to plant-based eating, because a lot of people, as an example, are preparing their lentils and legumes incorrectly here.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to somewhere like India, for instance, where this is a staple in their diet, they're soaking their lentils overnight, 24 hours. They're letting all of those oxalates and phytates to remove and get and settle out of their plant-based sources of protein. And it actually makes it easier to cook. It does take a
Mhm.
little bit of preparation to think ahead to prepare these things. But when we do that soaking, that makes it automatically more bioavailable when you
Mhm.
do cook and consume it. So instead of just taking it out of a can or so preparation is a really important component that I think a lot of people from the plant-based community don't talk about enough.
Mhm.
And it really matters.
Yeah.
And you'll notice that you won't have the bloating and gas and all of these things that people complain about when they eat really
Right.
high plant-based
Right.
diets. You don't have that when you prepare your foods properly. Um, and you're not just thinking about, a lot of people think, oh, I just need to eat a bunch of salad. No, you should be eating more cooked vegetables, really preparing your foods properly for your body to be able to accept them better. So I would say food preparation. Um, what was my other one?
Pairing. So
Food pairing, food preparation.
yeah,
Yes. And
and
just
how you
knowing
and
that,
just making sure you cook it.
yeah,
So
exactly.
cooking,
Exactly.
pairing, and, preparation, and
Exactly.
you remind me of I don't know if I told you, but I have a master's in nutrition and
Ooh,
functional medicine,
love it.
which is
I love
unusual
it.
for a doctor, but with the University of Western States, I think Dr. Mark Hyman,
Mark Hyman. Yep. Hmm.
Furman's on my mind because I'm talking to you. It's so funny. In fact, Dr. Furman is when I started my journey, I think he had How to Disease Proof Your Kids. I think that was his book, but that's kind of what got me down the plant-based approach in my earlier years. So, but
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
absolutely know all of those guys, and I'm really I'm understanding that just this conversation around how do you manage and it's nuance. The only thing that is challenging, I'm on the south side of Chicago, is making sure we have a person like yourself who has this education in front of the patients. And it does require, it's so easy to just say eat a ribeye versus the plant. So it's like we have to make sure when people are trying to make these decisions for good reasons for them, that they have the people, the resources. And I think our healthcare system is failing us in that we don't have coaches. And even when we have coaching, there's a cost. It's usually not free, and people
Hmm.
just can't afford it. And it's really, in fact, when I was at the Metabolic Revolution rally, Dr. Mariala Glant, who's an endocrinologist as well, is working on having kind of an app to kind of have an app that provides coaching and
Yep.
information for people. And it's just trying to figure out how to make that work. So I just think all of that stuff is important. So it sounds like, because one of the questions I was going to ask you was, related to grains, but it sounds like if somebody's eating quinoa, because Vinnie Tortorich has this no sugars, no grain
Hmm.
concept, but if you're eating quinoa, it sounds like the order in which you may consume it was kind of going to answer that question. So I think we may have answered that. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but that's
Yeah.
my thoughts.
I,
Yeah.
eating, obviously reordering your food is critical for most people, even if you don't have diabetes, critical.
Yeah.
But I think that that's interesting because I do have a pretty interesting, potentially slightly pessimistic leaning view on grains in American food. I just
Oh,
really struggle with
yeah.
agriculture. I
Yeah.
think that the way that I'm a big advocate for understanding where your food's grown and who you're buying your food from, because we have, with the advent of agriculture, over a century ago, it has gotten progressively more problematic with
Mhm.
each passing decade since we've been, here. And our soil is stripped of a lot of really critical essential nutrients because of how agriculture has been um, promoted, how farmers have been forced to grow food for
Yep. Yep.
for
Yep.
lack of a better
Yep.
way to say that. So I understand why people do better without carbohydrates, especially here in America, because our
Mhm.
our our grains aren't as nutrient dense as you
Mhm.
would find them in other
That's right.
places.
That's true.
So
Yeah.
I do understand that. But
Yeah.
this is just another plug for um, doing a little bit of research, understanding where your food's coming from. Also, I do love testing certain type, like you had mentioned before, understanding what types of grains work better for your body type, and continuing to retest that, because I think it's important to realize and remember that as your body becomes less inflamed, less
Mhm.
aggravated, your body starts to respond to things differently. So check back in. You might actually have a really big problem with quinoa now, but as you're, 6 months down the line of managing your diabetes, focusing on your glucose, healing your gut, doing all of these things that are take some time, test it again. See if these things work better for you now, because obviously I don't think it's all grains are a problem. I think that the way that we're growing our grains is a problem. So
Mhm.
education and you know, advocating for yourself in the grocery store and picking the right brands and the right
That's right.
people are great, is really important. Growing your food, if you have the availability to do urban gardens, which I'm getting mine tomorrow, by the way. I'm so
Hello.
excited. um, an indoor urban garden for myself.
That's
But
nice.
doing what you can to to have more or even just supporting your local farmers,
That's right.
people that grow food in your home, where their farms are,
That's right.
how they're treating their foods. That's going to make a big difference too. And I don't think people talk about that enough either.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, in America, we are really far down on the food
Yeah.
chain in terms of how we're preparing growing our food. So I think that that's an important piece
Yeah.
of the puzzle for people that
Me
really hate grains here. I get it. I
Yeah.
get
There's
it.
some issues, right? And in fact, I've been thinking about making some YouTube videos beyond the podcast. I try to make a periodic video short, and I've been thinking about talking about, why is it that we allow our food to have these dyes that other countries don't? Why is it that we allow these things when, if we're such an outlier? It's almost like, why do we allow lobbyists and special interests? Why do we allow legal bribery in politics, right? I mean, not to
Or
bring up
or
politics,
in
just
nutrition, or in
yeah, it's like, yeah, like the biases. And one of the things that the metabolic revolution, which had Nina Teicholz involved as well, is that influence of the dietary guidelines it has a lot of bias, and that should just not exist. We have to come up, if we're going to have
Mhm.
recommendations, we have to remove bias. And it's just unfortunate that the big money is making all of these decisions for us. So I think at this point, I'm going to shift the conversation just a little bit more in allowing you to, kind of sell vegetarian. But before I do that, I'll ask anybody who is checking us out, whether you're leaning in the low carb direction or the low fat direction, maybe in the comments of the YouTube video, and even maybe comment in the podcast app as well. What's been your experience? Were you like me, plant based at some point and shifted to low carb? Are you still plant based and thriving? Are you low carb and thriving? This would be a good time for people to just share their testimonials. And I think that's important, that people understand that both approaches can help people. And I just like to hear anecdotal testimonials, because I had, in fact, a clinic today. I didn't see a lot of people today. It was my obesity clinic. But I shifted that day to a regular day, but I only had like 8 people because it was a last minute decision. And like 3 people came in with testimonials. A1Cs used to be 10, now they're like 6, and they're just
Mhm.
doing a great job. So I love testimonials. So let's make sure we inspire people with that. Sometimes those inspire much more than what we're talking about. So
Oh, heck
just
yeah.
hearing from people,
Heck
yeah.
yeah.
So
Heck yeah.
so let's get a little bit mechanistic about it real quick, and just your perspective on what key mechanisms. I know we talked about mTOR, but what key mechanisms do you feel are more beneficial, or that are going to occur because of a plant-based diet as it relates to longevity, since that's kind of the area you focus on?
Mhm. I always answer things in several ways. Thanks for being patient with me. um, I will say, from the research that we have, and here at El Nutra, we really are a science-based company. We're constantly trying to figure out the best uh, the best solutions to nutrition based protocols and for disease management and even prevention. And one of the things that we found in our 25 years of research is that there are three things. I'm kind of going to back my way into your question, by the way.
All right.
There are three main reasons why people have metabolic related conditions, according to what we found. One is obviously insulin resistance, right?
No doubt.
So, and issues with, the ability for our body to not regulate our glucose as well because of many reasons. The second is muscle loss. So the idea that a lot of us, and this goes back to physical inactivity, aging in many ways, not getting enough of the right types of nutrients to support your lean body tissue. But the third piece of this is the aging of your cells. And over time, your cells are aging. You are as old as your cells are, or you're as young as your cells are. And I think it's really important to understand, and that's kind of why I was saying earlier that you should always personalize your keep coming back and retesting things as you get healthier, because you might notice that your body can do more things, better things, more, you might be able to run longer. You might be able to eat certain things in a better way. The more that you start to heal, and the cellular aging piece is really important, because when you think about from a longevity perspective, it's not just nutrition. Nutrition is one of several pillars, but one of the main secondary pillars to that is not always eating.
Right.
We're constantly eating. So the idea of intermittent fasting and time restricted eating, the concept of circadian eating is really helpful too for people when it comes to managing glucose spikes, managing mitigating the effects of high cortisol, because you're just starving yourself for too long and you're not eating at the right times. I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but there's a lot that goes into it. It's not just food, it's also everything that comes around your lifestyle and how you're treating your lifestyle. But to give you a couple pieces of fun testimonial, I'll give you two that comes to my mind right away. Number one, I had a patient that came to see me, I think probably in March of this year. And he had terrible celiac disease, on the verge of prediabetes, right there within like a point of being pre-diabetic. Metabolism, mitochondria was just a wreck. LDL super elevated, cholesterol super elevated. All of these markers are very tied to diabetic patients as well. And we did a protocol that was primarily plant-based, actually entirely plant-based, outside of a little bit of fish every now and again. I think we had fish once a week for the course of maybe 3 or 4 months. We went and did his labs against his CRP. The main marker for inflammation was just off the roof. He was feeling awful, like at his wit's end. We only were in a protocol, and I'm not saying that this is as quick for everybody. A lot of my patients need more time, but after about 3 months, his entire leaky gut issue went away. LDL dropped back down. HbA1c was back in a normal range. CRP was in a normal range. Everything was normal. And this was primarily from plant-based eating, focusing on circadian eating patterns, some types of intermittent fasting per his unique body and his unique situation, his lifestyle, and also focusing on stress reduction, improving sleep, moving your body the right way. All of these things totally improved. I mean, I remember thinking this was right before Mother's Day. He's like, I'm really nervous. I'm going to Napa with my girlfriend's mom, and there's going to be some things that I haven't eaten in a long time. And I was like, listen, let's say you go to Napa and you do just eat all the things after these 3 months of being really diligent and working with me on this. You've just proven to yourself how quickly your body responds when you decide to recalibrate again. So go have a really wonderful time. Enjoy your time there. Eat what you're going to eat. If you feel awful when you're back, recalibrate, do it again. Look how quickly your body responded. It was incredible. So that was one really amazing example of a personal patient that I saw. But I will
Let's
also say
go.
that um, at El Nutra, we have a diabetes regression and remission program. And it's a
Okay.
program in which we use uh, a low glycemic fasting mimicking diet in protocol over the course of well, the program is a total of 12 months, but you use the cycles of FMD for 6 consecutive months in tandem with the longevity diet, which is primarily plant-based. And we have an average of after just the 6 months, we have an average of 1.4 reduction in HbA1c. We usually have about 65% ish people reducing medication reliance. So they're actually reducing medication needs. We have 22-pound weight loss that's primarily from visceral fat protecting muscle mass. So there's just incredible benefits to, again, not only the personalized nutrition component, but also the ancillary things that you're doing to support your body to this the cellular at a cellular level. Like, how are you supporting um the age of your cells and how well your cells are actually functioning? So hopefully that's sort of inspiring. I
Yeah.
there's one with a full protocol with FMD, and then another one that was a personal anecdote patient of mine recently that I would just have been so impressed by. So
Excellent.
yeah.
And I'll only so I'm looking at I wrote down what you said, and so I'm just gonna comment just briefly on so insulin. In fact, when people enter this like plant low carb space, they enter it primarily to fix insulin resistance. So you had insulin resistance. That's like the first thing that you mentioned. So for those, just to keep people in the low carb community from panicking,
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to put that out there. So when you do a keto diet, of course, and for people like myself, carnivore, you're definitely going to lower your insulin level. And when you lower your insulin level, you're going to reduce your risk for insulin resistance. Now, I don't consider keto a high protein diet per se,
It
but
it
you
should
know,
be. It's high
right?
fat,
Exactly,
high
exactly.
fat diet. Yeah.
So I think I say that to say you're certainly going to get sufficient protein. So when it comes to muscle loss, it should mitigate that if you're on that type of dietary pattern. And then you mentioned cell aging, of course, and there's definitely some issues with. And I mentioned that because of that, concern about mTOR. But at the end of the day, if we don't go crazy on protein, even if that's a thing, right? You can, if you're doing a proper keto diet, you're not really, it's kind of a higher fat diet, et cetera. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And I know another person who was there were two, we had a few, like when I was at the Metabolic Revolution, we had Dr. Georgia Eat there, Dr. Chris Palmer, and basically they're, low carb docs that deal with mental illness and other
Mhm.
neurodegenerative diseases that way. And we know that there's a little protection. Ketones, because of beta hydroxybutyrate, can be brain protective. And there's certainly that fasting mimicking effect is there as well. So I think, and
Mhm.
I've seen studies where there's mice that have done better with that dietary pattern. So I'm only putting that in front of people just so they'll know, because again, everybody's coming to their diet for different reasons. But if you're in that space where you're saying, okay, I really have thrived with keto or even carnivore, can I feel comfortable doing that in lieu of this conversation? So when you think about, let's go to another question just related to the future of nutrition. How are things looking in the nutrition field? Is it your company? I guess we should speak about your company. Is your
Yeah.
company more like, let's think about the things that help, and lifestyle is part of it, but part of it is also supplementation. So how do you guys balance that conversation?
Well, it kind of goes into I feel like most of what we're doing is looking at the future of nutrition and trying to
Okay.
help pave that way for people to better understand how to navigate this world and the changing environment that we find ourselves in. Um, one of the biggest one of the biggest things that we're finding in terms of, and this is very contrary to what people currently see as healthy nutrition, well, is the protein piece. And the reason you've brought up mTOR a couple times, and I keep wanting to say this, and I guess that now's the time. But when you think about diabetes specifically, and you think about glucose spikes, mTOR, when mTOR is activated, the downstream effect of mTOR being activated is actually IGF-1 activation as well, which is why high protein diets can also lead to diabetes, especially if it's coming from high animal-based sources of protein. So I have seen a lot of patients that are like, I barely eat a carbohydrate. I don't understand how I'm insulin resistant. And we find that it's because mTOR is activating their IGF-1. So you're not in the clear. And I want to make that super clear that you're not in the clear just because you're choosing to avoid carbohydrates entirely and switch to animal-based proteins. Like you're still going to get that IGF-1 activation, which is a huge component to diabetes, right? So, and in fact, the CEO of our company has said on many occasions that type 2 diabetes is high protein diets is the next type 2 diabetes, accelerator. So that's an important thing to note. That another play on balance, I always, if you're, if you want to eat animal proteins here and there, eat animal proteins here and there, but also eat other things. Make sure you have the fiber, make sure you have the fat, make sure you're eating whole foods and you're getting out to walk and you're doing all the things. I mean, it's important to balance everything regardless of where you're finding yourself. But I also think that the concept of, and not just caloric restriction, because I think that people have taken that a little bit too far, or can, similar to the, bad vegetarian diets, right? Like there's ways to do that poorly. I think when you're talking about caloric restriction, I think that there's a lot of people that aren't doing it healthfully. But there is intermittent fasting and even periodic prolonged fasting, which we do here at my company. And the commercially available version of that is called Prolon. You can purchase Prolon's fasting mimicking diet that you can purchase on your own, or you could come to our medical division and be part of the program for diabetes remission specifically. But the idea of caloric restriction and through intermittent fasting and periodic prolonged fasting has a significant impact on our body's ability to rest, recharge, activate things like autophagy. So it's not just, you mentioned ketosis being really wonderful for bypassing, all of those really wonderful butyrates passing into the brain, giving you more brain clarity, energy. But really the benefit of doing a prolonged fast, it's about, anywhere from 3 to 5 days periodically throughout your year, in addition to some intermittent fasting on a daily basis, you're actually activating autophagy, which is a form of cellular rejuvenation. It's where your cells actually go and repair or recycle old and dying parts of the cell and replace it with better functioning parts. And the reason that exists is because when food was not available to us, when we were evolving as Homo sapiens, we didn't have food available all the time, but we still needed to have the energy to go get the food if we haven't eaten for 3 days, right? We still have to go fight to get that bear, hunt that thing to get food. So our body adapted by repairing old and malfunctioning cell parts, replacing them for new ones so that your body actually functions better. We did not evolve to eat all the time. So I think that's a really important component when we talk about, diabetes didn't become a thing until, the latter half of the last century. We didn't, and partly because, actually, can I give you one of my favorite history lessons for a second? This is one of my favorite things to tell people. The diabetes began on the heels of so we had around the 1940s, 1950s, we had the first advent of people dying of heart attacks, and people were super confused. They're like, what is happening?
Right.
What was happening was that we ended up cultivating farms, and there were animal protein consumption skyrocketed. So all of us, instead of eating more plant-based diets and farming our own foods, we were sitting at home. We had, cows and sheep and lamb, and we were eating a lot more animal proteins, and which have trans fats and saturated fats that can clog arteries and things like that. So instead of when they did the research to figure out that, it was the fats that were causing the heart attacks, instead of differentiating between the healthy fats, which are mono and polyunsaturated fats found in like seeds and avocados, versus the saturated and trans fats that can cause artery damage, they just said fat is bad. Fat's bad.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened in an agricultural market when you tell everyone that fat is causing you to have a heart attack is you start taking fat out of food. You completely take fat out of all of food. So we went through a huge, I'm sure you remember this, we went through like several decades of low fat everything, low fat cheese, low fat this, low fat that. But unfortunately, fat is what makes food taste good. And food manufacturers realized, oh shoot, no one's going to buy my food because there's no umami flavor of that fat. So what am I going to add to it? Sugar. I'm going to add sugar instead. It's
That's
a
right.
low calorie food at the upfront. No one's going to know that over time it actually does contribute to fat compilation, but and then people get addicted to sugar as well. So diabetes began then when we went through this low fat diet craze that everyone was avoiding fat, turned to low fat everything. Now we're getting inundated with sugar, which as we know is diabetes devil, right? And we haven't recovered. We haven't really recovered from this yet. And we're still seeing honestly some epigenetic effects of this as well, right? From centuries of or from decades of people having, so much, not only the continuation of food, like constantly eating and food's constantly available, we're never not eating, but we're also eating foods that are super high in sugar, super high in carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that in our grocery stores today. So we're resetting as a community, we're resetting as a society, I think, and really coming back to our roots. And one of the ways that we're doing that here at El Nutra is through the fasting mimicking diet and through cellular rejuvenation and autophagy and all of those really incredible ways to help your body kickstart its own ability to repair itself. And I think that's a really critical piece of the nutrition future that I love to talk about.
Absolutely. I want to two things. Number one is I want you to kind of answer this question, just your approach. So, so the question is going to be if a person like myself, who was plant based and doesn't really tolerate. Maybe I didn't do it perfectly like you suggested, how I prepared the food, etc. But plants just cause gas, irritation. I did hear you earlier say you just gotta cook it a certain way. After 8 years, I just couldn't tolerate it, and I just feel like $1,000,000 doing carnivore, which is pretty extreme relative to where you are. But before you answer that question in terms of what do you do with a guy like me that comes before you, and many people who follow me who are checking this out, they just do well with keto or carnivore. So, and then but the other thing is this idea of saturated fat. And I know a lot of times when I bring up saturated fat, I will, point people to the American Journal of Cardiology, and they put out a position statement. I can't remember what year, but in the last year or two, and it basically said that saturated fat does not increase morbidity and mortality. It's not associated with heart disease. It's protective against stroke. So when people are hearing your perspective, they're hearing me quote things from the Journal of College of Cardiology. And I think that was because when they started to look at randomized trials and compare it to observational, they found that saturated fat wasn't the devil we thought it was. So I think, and I'm only bringing that part up because I want this to be a conversation where we're just providing perspectives to provide cover for the people who are like, oh, is saturated fat good or bad? And I think in the low carb community, we don't consider it bad. That's really an interesting
Mm-hmm.
concept. But I know my Dr. Terry Mason, who we talked about briefly before we started, who I, hang out with on Monday nights, who's plant-based, and he was on Forks Over Knives, he would say it's definitely bad. So I think people get confused when they're hearing different sides of the story. We would argue that study was poorly done. It was observational. It's not as important as the randomized trial. And I think that's one thing I want to mention. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but the main thing I want you to comment on is when you get a guy in front of you or a gal who is keto, carnivore, you've been given the privilege of advising them, and they really have done well. And maybe those numbers, those metabolic numbers look great for them. Okay, the LDL may be a little bit higher. Okay, the total cholesterol, but in our community, we don't care about the total cholesterol because it includes the good, bad, etc. And we are more concerned about the quality of the LDL particle. So if the quality is good, you have less small particles versus large particles, we don't even worry about it. But I think the plant-based community still worries about it. So how do you have that conversation with them so that they can walk away not running out your door, but saying, you know what, I can work with her. She may be plant-based, but I can work with her. How do you manage that? Because I do it. I have plant-based people I have to talk to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a saturated fat perspective, you say that it's only in the animal-based community that you don't care about it as much, don't think about it that much. But honestly, plant-based people, a lot of us don't either. And the reason that I say that is the most perfect example is coconut oil.
Yeah,
The amount of coconut oil that we have in plant-based cooking
that's
and
true.
plant-based eating is huge, and coconut oil happens to be a saturated fat. So
It
it's
is.
hotly contested in the nutrition community as
Yeah,
well,
I'm sure.
because it's and I think it really does come down to, and by the way, I know we talked a little bit about dietary guidelines not being
Mm-hmm.
a perfect use case, and I completely agree with that. It's great to have guidelines for people to kind of get a sense, but they are very imperfect.
Yeah,
But I will say that it doesn't exclude saturated fat. It doesn't exclude saturated fat.
right. Yeah, that's
It
right.
does say to limit it in a way, right? So we do need to limit saturated fat, but we don't need to completely avoid the only one and only fat that you should absolutely be doing your darndest to avoid is trans fats. And that is,
Absolutely.
there's no one, I don't think, in any community that will deny that trans fats are going to cause heart disease. Okay.
That's right. That's right.
But I do think it goes back to um, the type and the derivative of the saturated fat too, because I do think that when you eat, and again, I have lots of people in my practice that eat animal proteins and that do well with animal proteins. That's totally fine. But you do need to make sure that you recognize that when you have an animal protein that does have saturated fats, it's more likely to turn into a trans fat upon consumption. Less so when you consume a saturated fat from a plant-based source of plant-based food. So I think that's also part of it. It's kind of goes back to that conversation of plant-based proteins are less likely to spike mTOR and IGF-1 than animal-based proteins. You know, same protein, same amino acids, different sources, and part of that is the nutrition synergy, part of it's the fiber, part of it where it's being derived from, that kind of thing. So I think that's an important component, and I'm all about balance. I think that that's a huge, if you're not helping people define balance, if you are too strict and stringent on your philosophy and your experience, you are going to drive people away. You're not going to make change. And also, it's not
Mm-hmm.
sustainable. I mean, the other thing too is, like, how do you do this all the time? You can't do it all the time. Sometimes there's things like the holidays. There are things like birthdays and vacations in which you're doing these things, and you shouldn't not, because that's actually really healthy for your soul and your heart and your community, spending and sharing time with people that you love. That's really healthy for longevity reasons too, right? But we need to balance it out, and we need to balance it with, you know, more, plants when you're home, walking when you're home,
Mm-hmm.
doing intermittent fasting, periodic fasting throughout the year. All of these things help to balance your portfolio of health, rather than just saying, okay, this is the one thing that I do, or this is the one way that I live and I can't deviate whatsoever. I think
Right.
that type of mindset in any facet, nutrition, politics, you name it, is going to cause a real big chasm in your ability to live your healthiest and most abundant life.
Yeah. Well, my hope is that this episode, for those people in my community who actually were able to get through the episode, because people are funny about these things, right? Is to, if you're in politics, it's okay to go from Fox to MSNBC. You should
Right.
watch both, and you should hear both perspectives. And I would say the same is true with nutrition. So I hope people hear something that made them curious tonight, as we kind of are wrapping up this episode. And we always want to question things. I mean, and when I went from plant-based to animal-based, it was because I questioned things. And I think as long as we're doing that and we're open to pivoting or adjusting, I think that's going to be important. I also think that this idea of, you know, uh, you know, uh, experimentation. So if I were to use the language of balance, as you've suggested, for example, for a guy who had irritable bowel that got better doing low carb, I had a previous guest, and they were actually sisters, and they talked about an app called the Monash app,
Mhm, mhm,
Monash, right? And
mhm.
and so for a person who's maybe a carnivore like myself, but interested in adding back, maybe that app is a good way for them to experiment in a way that'll less likely impact their system in a way that harms them. So I think no matter where people land with these conversations, I think it's important you do your own experiment, and what your version of balance will be is going to be based on what your body tells you it should be. Now, you have to be careful, because some people come to me and say, I can't tolerate protein. And well, maybe they hadn't really given their acid time to build up. Maybe maybe
Mhm.
their bile is not at an optimal level because they had surgery, or just because they haven't been eating fat and things like that. So I think people, as you hear these conversations, this is not a, okay, slam dunk, do it this way, not that way. It's about hearing perspectives. Maybe somebody will hear this conversation and say, well, let me look up mTOR and understand that better. Let me see how that impacts my body. And then you just grow and learn from there. So I just wanted to tee up my kind of closing questions with that, and just, again, it's been a good conversation for me to kind of hear your perspective. I'm not hearing a lot that makes me say you're nuts or crazy. I'm hearing that
Thank
you've
goodness.
right,
Thank goodness.
you've thought through these things, and it's logical and it makes sense for you. So let's go to the, how you plan to protect your nest question. And again, that's my podcast. That's my message. Is it's not just about diet. It's about other factors. It's exercise, less stress, more sleep, our thoughts, recovering from trauma, healthy relationships, avoiding organisms and pollutants that harm us, and making sure our emotions and our life experiences are serving us. So when you think about those things, where do you plan to give extra attention over the next 12 months?
Oh, God, that's so good. Me personally?
Yeah.
Is this a me personally
You
question?
personally, yes.
Well, I will say that this is completely not about nutrition whatsoever. Obviously, your nest, you just nailed all of the most important things for
Right.
longevity. I think if I didn't hear you mention sense of purpose, but if it's not in there, it should be.
Amen.
Um, but that's a really big one.
Yeah.
But I would say, so I'm pregnant actually.
Hello.
Hello. So I think in terms of protecting my nest, I am going to be leaning quite a bit into my community, leaning on my community and learning. I
Yeah.
think right now I'm in a very interesting time in my life where, I am very good at taking care of myself and being independent and having a mind that can, solve any problem. And I'm realizing very quickly that this is something that you do you have to rely on community.
Yeah.
And I think that that is where my nest is going to be focused for the next
That's
4
right.
months, is
Yes.
letting my community help me and leaning into this new phase of life. So
Yeah, you take the nest concept to a
to a
whole
whole new
other
level.
level when you're talking
There's
about.
actually a nest happening
I
here.
know, that's right. Wow, so that's a beautiful thing. So that explains your glow, and I appreciate that. So and I guess the last question is really just you sharing how people can get to rather social media, your company. How can people
Yeah,
reach you?
absolutely. For anything related to my company, definitely visit prolonlife.com, which is prolonlife.com. That will give you lots of information on cellular rejuvenation, fasting mimicking, and all the ways that you can. And also, it will lead you to our L Nutra Health diabetes program too, which I think that anybody on this show is interested in learning more about that. And you can find me personally on Instagram at Health and Melness, which is HealthNMellness, Health and Melness. And I post a lot of educational resources and tips and tricks there. I really try to pride myself on being a helpful resource to people. So if you're just interested in information and knowledge, you can find more about that there.
Hey, all right. Well, Melanie, I've enjoyed it and really excited about your future because my kids are 25 and 27, and I'm
Oh
trying
my
to get them
gosh.
out of my nest at this
You're
point.
get out of here.
Get out of here.
It's your time's up.
Time's up. We've done all we can. So spread those
Oh man.
wings and start
Oh,
flying.
good
So I'm
for
really
you.
excited.
Good for them.
Nothing's more exciting than starting a family. It's not for everybody, but for those who choose that path, it forces you to kind of go backwards and remember what life was like. And I love when, even because I'm a family doctor, but I mostly see adults, and so when people bring their grandbabies and little people in, it's just a ball of energy and a bundle of joy. So I'm really excited about this day. This will be your first child?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're
Wish me
about to
luck. Wish me
your
luck.
mind's about to be blown. So you can read about it, you can hear from people, you can even take care of other babies, but when it's you,
Yeah.
whew, it is.
I'm that's beginning to sink in already.
It's a big
Yeah.
deal. So I'm really excited for you, and I can't wait to see those pictures in the
Oh,
future.
thank
So I'll make
you.
sure to keep in touch so I can enjoy the miracle of life. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm going to wrap up with a couple of comments before we end. Okay.
Thank you so much, Tony. It was great.
No problem. I want to thank today's guest for sharing her wonderful insights and her journey. Inspiring to see how different dietary patterns can intersect and still support the same goal. As you know, I'm the metabolic health doc, and that's what it's all about. And it's nice to know that that you can get there potentially with both diets. So, some key takeaways is no matter what your dietary preference, there are ways to make thoughtful low carb choices that can help you reach your health goals. And it's a reminder that we all share common ground together and we learn from each other's experiences. So hopefully some of what Melanie shared today will help you on your journey. Of course, if you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And I think this is a community and we're all trying to grow together. I really want to make sure you do what we started with, which is vegetarians and carnivores can live in harmony. You just saw it happen. We're not fighting, we're not yelling, we're not screaming, we're not trying to overtalk each other. We're just sharing our perspective. That's the world we want to live in, guys. We want to live in a world where rational people can get in front of each other, have dialogue, and discuss topics of interest. So I really appreciate each and every one of you for coming to this episode of the Protecting Your Nest podcast. And until the next episode, continue to be safe, be well, and continue to protect your nest.